All right. Good morning, everybody. This is part two of my introductory comments on All the Pretty Horses. We finished up talking about some aspects of his style, and I am going to talk about the genre of the Western and the various characters that we encounter in this kind of genre. And we have talked about the protagonist. There's always, most often, always a masculine or a male hero. But that's not the case with every Western. One of my favorites is a book called True Grit, where you have a female protagonist, Maddie Ross. It's also a great movie. I recommend that. Um, but typically, MacCarthy is writing from the point of view or from the omniscient narrator's perspective of the male protagonist. This perhaps could be one criticism that MacCarthy might be vulnerable to, and perhaps rightly so. He has responded to it also, which is that he tends to focus on writing what he knows, and I said something along the lines of writing a female character for him would not be a task he felt as certain about as he would from writing in the perspective of a male character. So in the Western genre, you typically have a male adventurer, and sometimes this adventurer will foray into some kind of unknown, uncharted territory and have to encounter and navigate these sort of cultural differences that arise based on his displacement from his home culture to whatever culture he's discovered on his journeys. And so these journeys happen on the frontier. And in the older westerns, the frontier was anything kind of west of the Mississippi. And even before that, the idea of the West used to be the Hudson Valley, when they were first colonizing the states. And then, as colonization became more established, the West got pushed farther and farther west until we ran out of the West. Alaska is probably one of the last frontiers. And in the situation in Cormac McCarthy's All the Pretty Horses, the frontier is also south of Texas in the borderlands into Mexico. So, concerning Cormac McCarthy's female characters, we can discuss this when we encounter more of them, but he often does include these domestic gender roles where there's some sort of matriarchal or maternal figure who is the cook, who is taking care of and sort of maybe even like this idea of the goddess of the hearth type of archetype. And we see that with Louisa in the earlier chapters. Um, some argue that there's a sort of a two-dimensional side to these female characters. They're not as developed. We're going to meet Alejandra later on, portrayed in the movie by Penelope Cruz. Um, and we can discuss the depth of her character as well as that of her grandmother, who is a very strict matriarch and has a lot of power in the family household. Um, Cormac McCarthy in this novel will incorporate the trope or the archetype, whatever word you want to use, the pattern of maybe the femme fatale, the girl that might be considered the heartbreaker for the male protagonist who's going through this rite of passage into adulthood, and part of that is falling in love, perhaps getting your heart broken, maybe repairing that, maybe not. We'll have to see. Um, there is some degree of idealization. Is that the right word I want to use? Yeah, in that John Grady Cole when he falls in love, he kind of gets blinders on. One might make the critique that there's a sexualizing or an objectification of women that is present in John Grady Cole's experience and in the way that Cormac McCarthy writes the story. That's something that we should talk about as we encounter it. But it is true that there are some strengths to these two female characters. And so, again, let's discuss this, and that would be fine to be critical of the novel with regard to gender roles, or to maybe examine, is this a fair treatment? Does it detract from the novel that he is kind of going by prescribed gender roles, or is it okay for him to do this? So those are all things that, like I say, we'll have to discuss when we get to it. A note again about the genre and the purpose of the Western novel is to create for the reader this sense of the majestic unknown that lies beyond the boundaries of the known. And in this case, like the boundary being a geographical one, kind of crossing over the Rio Grande River into Mexico. And in order for Cormac McCarthy to keep alive the sense of amazement and wonderment, almost a romantic ideal of nature as this very powerful force, that swallows up humans, and by contrast makes human endeavors seem, it puts them on this smaller scale, but nonetheless it doesn't, the awareness of that greatness of nature doesn't stop characters like John Grady. It inspires them perhaps to try even harder. More on that to come. But one of the ways, though, that Cormac McCarthy keeps alive this relationship between the characters who are these sort of small in comparison to the vastness of the territory around them. He uses a lot of stock diction. And what I mean by stock diction, or what critics mean by, or words that he will repeat again and again, words that have certain connotations that are meant to kind of keep alive a certain vibe or an atmosphere. And in the Western genre, the atmosphere that you want to keep going is this idea of the smallness of humans when placed in the larger context of the natural setting and the expanse of the frontier, and the limitless capacity for danger, the limitless potential for adventure and opportunity. And if a protagonist has enough courage and boldness, he or she can strike out into that and have an experience, either good or bad, or both. So Cormac McCarthy will use a lot of repeated words as a way of keeping that atmosphere alive. Also, a lot of visual motifs are repeated. For example, like the scenes at a campfire with the night sky, certain types of food and drink, highlighting the remoteness and the isolation of a character. Even the sparse philosophical conversations going on between Rollins and John Grady. These are all motifs that continue to reinforce of this sort of Western atmosphere. Okay, so the American Adam and the myth of the West. I need to explain what this is. The myth of the West contains this idea that there's this expansive, unexplored, full of opportunity land that is there for the taking or there for the enjoyment, the exploration, if one is willing to take the risk, be bold and adventurous. And it's a very romantic concept. And it was something that many of the artists that started to create during the period of colonization and westward expansion, they loved. There are certain artistic types that love to get there out there on the edge and commemorate the vastness of the American wilderness. So a Western novel is going to use all of that as a setting, and it becomes a wonderful backdrop for an adventure story or for a story filled with trials and tribulations and things both man-made and both nature-made that are going to test the characters. But I included these two paintings here by the Hudson River School painters. They were painting out of this valley here. Certainly they traveled farther. But this idea that, man can do, humans can slowly situate themselves at the frontier and live sort of within it, but that there's a certain overwhelming quality to that, as you can see by this idea of the cabin kind of dwarfed by the horizon and the landscape. It almost reminds me of the way that Bewick's some of his paintings, or not paintings, but woodcuts are organized. Now, what is the American Adam? Again, we talked about the expanse of the Western wilderness, and when you're coming from this Western tradition steeped in Christianity and the myths of Christianity, there is this idea that paradise was lost. And I mentioned Milton earlier. Paradise meaning the Garden of Eden. Human beings were kicked out. And some people raised this concept that perhaps the New World was a second chance to regain Eden, to regain paradise. And so figures like Huck Finn, for example, became the means by which the collective spirit of the people in the New World could experiment with this idea that perhaps there is a chance to reclaim paradise. Perhaps there is a way of placing ourselves back into this unknown, unexplored territory here in the West, and perhaps discovering and reclaiming our place in the natural world that was somehow disrupted during or at the time of the mythological fall of mankind. So there's a tremendous amount of optimism and hopefulness that if you had the right courage, the right mettle, the right disposition, that you might be able to participate in rejoining paradise. So that's the idea of the American Adam. Not often talked about as the idea of the American Eve, but we could transpose the title according to the gender as needed. And I'll talk a little bit more about the American Adam in just a minute, in the next installment.